Okay, thank you so much. I'd like to start first by thanking you for giving us the opportunity to share our projects with you. So my talk is entitled Explanation in History, Methodological Reflections on Palestinian Historiography. I'm going to start first with a quick introduction before I move on to mention my outline. So I'll start by a quotation from Brandom's, making it explicit. We live and move and have our being in a space structured by norms. I'm interested in this talk to talk about the explanation of the historical past, which is the past that is populated by agents who occupy the normative sphere. So the question that I aim to answer throughout my presentation is if historical explanation, and I'll take it to be as a reconstruction of the historical past, if historical explanation is a reconstruction of the historical past, then what model should govern this reconstruction? And what role does agent-related evidence take in such reconstruction? The interest that I have, so I'm going to take a case study so I can make my account clear. It's the reconstruction of the past under erasure. That's why later on throughout my presentation, I'll be zooming in the work of historians who addressed the history of Palestine, specifically on the year of 1948, which corresponds to the establishment of the State of Israel, and on the time of 1967, which is the 5 Days War. So the outline would go as follows. I'm going to start first with the unificationist aspiration of unifying a model of explanation between science and history. I will focus very briefly on the work of Hempel and Mackey because they were the most explicit about this unificationist aspiration. Then I'm going to move on to answer the question of whose past are we narrating or whose past are we trying to reconstruct. Third, I will address my thesis, which is that of historicizing explanation, which offers a bottom-up approach, which starts with the structure of the evidence and the historical remains and moves on to build an explanatory model out of it. In section 4, this is where I zoom in the different writings of history that were written around this era. And in section 5, I end by giving a quick comment on writing history from within. So to move on to the first section, it's possible throughout the literature to distinguish between two approaches concerning the structure of historical explanation. I'm aware some of them are outdated, but I'm just going to keep like the unificationist aspiration and talk about its implications on narrating or reconstructing the past of marginalized communities. So in contrast with exceptionalism, unificationism in historical explanation is the theory that historical explanation has the same logical structure as the scientific one. The differences is the difference in degrees. It's in precision. Hempel calls historical explanation as explanation sketches. So unificationism position the philosophy of historiography within universal theories of causation, irregularity theories, conditional counterfactuals, probabilistic or process theories. On the other hand, there's the exceptionalist perspective, which maintain that because historical inquiry concerns agents, meanings, and norms, then the explanatory model should be different in kind than that of the natural sciences. My account would be more towards the exceptionalist perspective, but I will be addressing it by focusing on the structure of evidence specifically. So just a quick introduction to the Hempelian model. Hempel says that in history, as anywhere else in empirical science, the explanation of a phenomenon consists in subsuming it under a general empirical law. And then an explanation, therefore, is seen under the DN model, whose premises cite initial circumstances and natural laws, and whose conclusion cites the phenomenon, event, or fact to be explained. So this is the model put formally, where C1 to Cn are statements describing particular circumstances, L1 to Ln are general statements of law, and E is a statement describing the phenomenon to be explained. Historical, I'm not going to talk about this. I guess it's common knowledge now. Historical explanation for Hempel, therefore, is to be morphed into this form of explanatory model. For example, a population migrated because climatic conditions made survival possible is a proper explanation because it's subsumed under the general law that populations tend to migrate to regions that offer more favorable living conditions. So the connective vocabularies that usually historians use, such as hence, therefore, naturally, because, all of these, for example, presupposes a certain form of linking generalization. But because the generalization is not as explicit as it is in scientific explanation, Hampel refers to these as explanation sketches. A sketch consists of a more or less vague indication of the laws and initial conditions considered as relevant, and it needs filling out given which requires further empirical research for which the sketch suggests its direction. So this was one of the unification aspirations. The other one, a much more elaborate one, and the major one as well in the history, is that of J. Al-Maki. It started first by the work of Mark Wogo on historical explanation. And this is maintaining the unificationist aspiration, but modifying the model of explanation used under conditional theories rather than general laws. Waugh claimed that when historians in singular causal statements speak of a cause or the cause of a certain individual event B, they are referring to another individual event A, which is a moment in a minimal sufficient and at the same time necessary condition post factum. In other words, a cause is a constituent of this minimal sufficient complex, one among a conjunctive set of conditions that taken together present a sufficient condition for the outcome. G.M. Mackey elaborated on this further in Accusations and Conditions, the Cement of the Universe, and and he presented it as, can you still see me? Anyway, okay. And he presented it under the Inus condition, which is the insufficient but non-redundant part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. So the light thing is a Beirut experience. If you know anything about Beirut, this is one of its necessary traits. So as an ein, to go back to Maki, as A is an Ein's condition of a result P if and only if for some X and for some T, AX or T is a necessary and sufficient condition of P, but A is not a sufficient condition of P, and X is not a sufficient condition of P, but AX as a minimal sufficient set would be seen as a sufficient condition for P. To apply this, and so to transition smoothly into one second, so I can unbox. Awesome. I'm back. So to transition into some examples, just formally speaking, the set S, which contains the three events, E, E prime, and E second prime, E belongs to the set S of events such as S is a minimal sufficient condition for T, E satisfies a non-redundancy condition, and S is not the necessary condition for T. There exist other distinct sufficient sets for T. The UN partition, for example, let's move on to 1948, is a cause of Palestinian displacement. And this means that the set UN partition, Zionist military consolidation, and failure of the Arab revolt is a sufficient condition for the state formation. The removal of the UN partition would have weakened the sufficiency of the set, and the set is not necessary as there could exist distinct sufficient sets for the state formation. So this is generally the unificationist aspiration under the work of Hempel and Mackey. So I want to move on to ask about whose history are we writing and whose history are we reconstructing. And I make a difference between the natural past and the historical past. The past as a historical past is the past that is understood historically from the standpoint of those archival possibilities. What's that mean to move to use a quote famous by Collingwood in the Ideas of History? I'm going to read the one in red. The archaeologist's use of his stratified relics depends on his conceiving them as artifacts serving human purposes and thus expressing a particular way of which men have thought of their own life. And from this point of view, the paleontologist arranging his fossils in a time series is not working as a historian, but only as a scientist thinking in a way which can at most be described as quasi-historical. Historical events are brought about by agents, and agents act not because of their behavior conforms to natural laws, but because they are responsive to norms. Here I'm using a quote from Brandam's on articulating reasons. Once concept use is on the scene, a distinction opens up between things that have natures and things that have history. So the famous example that's usually used in the literature of history, the event that every time white smoke emanated from the Sistine Chapel in Rome, large crowds gathered and cheered. First explanation is the cheering occurred because white smoke appeared, and then the second one, which is the most appropriate one to use, is that the crowds cheered because a new pope was elected. So, in order for that in order that behavior patterns become assumed to be general laws, they must be constant, and so there must be in existence a social order which recurrently produces situation of a certain kind. But social orders themselves are historical facts and therefore subject to inevitable change. A positive science of mind will no doubt be able to establish uniformities and recurrences, but it can have no guarantee that the laws it establishes will hold good beyond the historical period from which the fact is drawn. So, to understand the past historically is to understand what Wittgenstein referred to as the form of life of the participants of the past. It's to explain their behavior and to grasp the way they reasoned, the inferences they drew, the conceptual connections they made, and the symbolic connections and significance they attached to their actions. Norms are historically situated, they change and can be broken. To understand historical actions is to understand them as responses to norms. Historiography deals with human actions. Historians, therefore, are concerned more with motives, intentions, beliefs, and interests. This form of naturalizing history, which comes as a result from an account of from the unificationist aspiration, would lead to this form of description. For example, historiography has been content to deal with the peasant rebel merely as an empirical person or member of a class, but not as an entity whose will and reason constituted the praxis called rebellion. The very metaphor through which rebellion is described already effaced agency. Peasant uprising break out like thunderstorm, heave like earthquakes, spread like wildfires, infect like epidemics. Here, the rebel appears as something moved rather than someone who acts. Revolt is seen as an instinctive and almost mindless physical suffering, which comes as like a result of Newton's law that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. This denormativized, as I said, as I'm mentioning here in the title, rebellion removes the meaning and significance of the movement by naturalizing it and providing the description that is used. So my main account, I thought that I have 30 minutes, so I'm gonna kind of move fast concerning this section specifically, is that the unificationist aspiration, specifically the ones seen in Hempel and Mackey, presents a top-down approach where the explanatory schema is fixed prior to engagement with the archive. Evidence is selected and evaluated only insofar as it fits the model. The past is made to appear as an instance of a general pattern, and what counts as relevant evidence is determined in advance and is amenable to objective checks. Here are some quotes I took from Hempel and from Mackey. We can go back to them in the Q&A, which shows that they both ascribe to a top-down approach. In contrast to the top-down approach, the theory that I'm aiming to argue for is under the title of historicizing explanation. I want to refer to the archive as the historian's workshop, and to say that any aspiration of the aspiration that was used in unificationism prioritizes a specific kind of archives, which are identified with state archives, and therefore we're going to end up with a form of writing history from above. So the question that I'm going to aim to answer here is what counts as empirical evidence for historians? The theory I'm advancing is a bottom-up approach, which starts with the structure of the evidence and the nature of the evidence and moves on to talk about methodology and to explanatory model. To historicize methodology is to recognize that evidentiary standards are historically situated. emerging within a specific agential, social, and political context. If the archive is historically produced, then so is what counts as evidence. And if evidence is historically situated, then the model of historical explanation cannot proceed. Rather than beginning with a pre-given explanatory form and fitting evidence to it, we must begin from the historically specific forms of evidence the situation makes possible and derive our explanatory model from them. So explanatory models in history must follow from the archive, not to precede it. What counts as evidence is historically specific, and the question then that I'll move on to answer is what kind of models of explanation and so methodologies are adequate to the forms of historical materials. My interest is historical materials under condition of erasure. So from the subaltern past, Chakrabarti claims that how do you write the histories of suppressed groups? How do you construct a narrative of a group or class that has not left its own sources? So the question whether or not such incorporation changes the nature of historical discourse itself can be answered simply. Of course it does. To be able to tell the story of a group through overlooked, to be able to master the problems of crafting such narratives, particularly under circumstances where the usual archives do not exist, is how the discipline of history renews and maintains itself. And so to move on to something we were discussing now in the Q&A, what troubles the logicians and the philosophers seems the least to worry those even amongst them who have had some experience of what working among the relics of the past means. Um, and from the point of view of those who are working among the relics, like what which the historian explains are quite like remarkably barren and irrelevant. So now my motivation is to go and to see what it means to work among the relics of the past, right? So focusing on Palestine 1948 and therefore zooming in on the different remains that are there, which through them the past would be reconstructed. The first evidence is what Walid Khalidi, a historian, who refers to as a non-event. A non-event is not an omission, it's actually something that has happened but was later on erased. There are two reasons for why non-events are there. First of all, because of erasure. In the story of Palestine's struggle for statehood, Khalidi claims that a significant proportion of those archival resources were at different times attacked, confiscated, and so one of the most important of these institutions, the PLO Research Center in Beirut, was attacked by Israeli with rockets and artillery on at least two separate occasions. Another historian, Bilal Shalash, who is writing about the history of 1967, when he was interviewing individuals who were alive in 1967 and who played a role in what was happening, they refused to say, answering why what happened is still happening. And so the line of continuity prevents people from speaking. For these two reasons, the historian is in front of an incomplete archive to begin with. Diving deeper into the evidence that is actually there, some of these evidences are seen as village books. So they are books that narrate the lived experiences of individuals that are within the village. Some of them include the remains that are left. So the first type of buldaniyat are the ones that include the photos, the photographs of destroyed villages. Khalidi, for example, has a collection of 500 photographs of different cities. Here you can see them in Palestine that were destroyed. So that's the Church of Mary Yohanna. The other is the rubble of the village house. This is all that has remained from what happened there, right? So this is used as a material in order for the reconstruction of the past. Another book, another type of a village book is one that is written by Palestinians themselves. They are not historians, but they are narrating about their lived experience, by older generation who grew up in the village, by social activists who aim to transform their communities through their connections to their heritage, by authors who were pushed and displaced as children, and they wanted to maintain that memory. The kind of evidence here require a genealogical methodology, one that recognizes how values arise from within lived continuity. These are examples of buldaniyat. A lot of what has remained from the archive are oral testimonies. And if you noticed, a lot of the new historians, such as Ilan Pape, they focus on their narrative about these oral testimonies themselves. Oral sources are necessary, if not sufficient, condition for a history of the non-hegemonic classes. Here in AUB, we have the Palestinian Oral History Archives. And so the methodology to address this is peculiar to the nature of the evidence itself. Another form of archiving under erasure is that of poetry. Fadwa Tuqan is a poet who was referred to as the poet of Palestine. In her poetry, she portrayed everyday's life under curfew, siege, and surveillance between 1967 and 1970s. Tuqan kept on writing about the events that unfolded back then, and her poetry is used by historians now in Birzeit in order to reconstruct the past. Another example of a poetry, you can read them, I have them here on the screen, is by Mustafa Khalil, who is here in the poetry describing his village. And so since only ruins were remained from the village, this gives us one of the tools in order to reconstruct a past that was erased. The last archive that I want to discuss is the archive of kids' drawing. In 1968, the Jordanian, I'm going to conclude, Mona Saadi, she kind of collected the work of Palestinian refugee problem who were children who were displaced from Nablus. So they wrote, they drew their experience, their displacement, and next to each one of these drawings, they put a caption under it. Can read them by a 6-year-old Zuhair, a tank, a road, and a dead person in the mountains. These for Yusra, they are the colors of the bomb. This drawing as well represent the Exodus 1967. To interpret them, the historian must adopt a phenomenological and hermeneutic methodology rather than reading the drawings as acts of testimony or attempts to kind of an attempt to make sense of the devastation through forms of color and aesthetic expression. So here what I have presented to sum this up, I'm not sure if I have more time. Do I have more time?
Yes, you have more minutes.
Okay. Okay, yes. Awesome. Yeah, so in summary, as the foregoing examples show, the historian's work under such conditions necessarily involves a mixed method approach, one that becomes visible through the diversity of archives from which history is written. To reconstruct the past requires interpreting oral testimonies, reading literary works as archives of experience, drawing on village books and local memories, examining ruins and material traces, and attending to silences, refusals, erasure as explanatory, relevant, and actually necessary for a historical reconstruction. Each of these sources demands a different mode of reading that no single explanatory schema can account for all of them. What emerges, therefore, is not a unified methodology, but multiple models of explanation, each derived from the form of evidence at hand. Here, the archive determines the method. The historian begins with the historically situated traces that survived and allows the logic of explanation to be generated from within them. This is the bottom-up approach introduced. Explanatory models must follow from the material and conceptual conditions through which the past becomes knowable rather than being imposed on it in advance. So here in the table, you can see different archival forms that are present, the appropriate methods, their explanatory aim, and why they resist a certain form of unificationism that was present in Hempel and in Maki. So to conclude, the historical to write history from within is to begin from the standpoint of the agents whose past we seek to understand. It's to reconstruct the field of reasons and commitments and meanings that structure their actions. Explanation here is interpretive rather than law-like. It aims to make intelligible how agents understood their situation. What emerges from the structure of the archive necessitate multiple models of explanation, each derived from the structure of evidence at hand. The bottom-up approach, to summarize, is an explanatory model that must follow from the material and conceptual conditions through which the past becomes knowable, rather than being imposed in advance. So to write history from within is to remain answerable to the normative space in which agents acted and interpreted their world, to understand their form of life, to be responsive to the peculiarity and multiplicity of the structure of archival materials and the methodologies that are relevant to them, and to remain answerable to the normative space in which agents acted and interpreted their world, and to recognize that the historian, the past agent, and history lives, moves, and has their being in a space structured by norms. Thank you.
Just a second. Thank you very much for such an amazing talks. Very interesting. So now we are going to move to the Q&A, and I'm going to ask the audience to go to reactions, raise your hand, and then I'm going to give the chance to you to ask a question. So meanwhile we get the first one, I have, sorry, no. So I have Aurelia, then I have Hanik, and we go from there. Aurelia, please. I think you can open your mic now.
Yeah. Thank you, Zaina, for your fantastic talk. I'm going to be very quick because we don't have that much time, and I love to listen to you. Like one of the, I don't know, of the part of the historian's training has to do with going into the archives and looking for the materials. But also a key element is that one cannot go into the archives without questions. Actually, if you go to the archive without them, you don't really find anything. There's nothing there to see. You find whatever you're already looking for. So I was wondering, what does it mean to set like the empirical evidence as the first step? I was also thinking, you might know this book, Side by Side, Israel and Palestinian Stories. Because one of what is striking about it is that there's no debate surrounding facts. It's actually how these facts are aligned or ordered that makes for completely different stories. So in those cases, like documents or empirical evidence would not actually be able to kind of settle these sort of questions. So I wanted to know how far are you willing to take the empirical evidence as the bottom line for historical debates?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Concerning the first one, I agree with you. So there's like a quote by Elton, I think one does not go to the archive naked. One goes with certain questions in mind, selectivity criteria, a certain point that they're trying to make within their narrative. And I do think that, strictly speaking, but what I meant by empirical evidence are the remains of the past. So all of these drawings, the testimonies that we had, the village books, this is strictly speaking what I mean by the remain of the past. Concerning your second question about debate, about facts, it wasn't very clear to me what the question is. If you can summarize it, please, in one.
Yeah.
Yes, you both can take it slowly. There is no rush. You finish a bit earlier. So yeah, just take a breath.
I thought I have 30 minutes. You told me I have 20, so I was like...
No. I was going to let you know when you had spoken for 20, so you had 10 more.
Oh, okay. Now I'll go slowly.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was taking as an example this book by Sami Adwan and Eyal Navar. It's called Side by Side, Parallel Histories of Israel and Palestine. What is interesting is that they use exactly the same facts. And like the empirical evidence, you might say it's exactly the same. But their stories are completely different and they're actually incompatible. So the same set of events are interpret it radically differently from each side. And that's kind of a sorrowing message from this book. But I think it tells us about the limits or the limitations of empirical evidence.
Yeah, I agree with you concerning this point. At the end of the day, the empirical evidence, they have a limitation. Both of them can be talking about their own lived experiences, and they, in this sense, they can be talking about the same facts, but the way they have lived this fact would be different. Yeah, I think then, like, the role of the historian in this sense is to be able to depict the lived experiences of these individuals, but at the end of the day, also to situate them within the historical facts that are taken for granted by across incommensurable narratives, if you want to say. Yeah, but I would be like, when was this book published?
Give me a second. It was published in 2012.
Okay, awesome. I will look it up. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much to the two of you. So now we can move to Hanik, please. I think you can open your mic now.
Yes, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm here. Well, first of all, I have to say thank you so much for your work. I think it's crucial and very, very important. I'm very excited of having someone that works like subjects that I work. Doesn't happen that much in Mexico, you know. I'm just thinking that these methodological approaches that you are offering here, they remind me some kind of sumut. And I think this is kind of theoretical sumut that I didn't know, or I didn't thought like it could be this complex. So would you think of like sumut or?
Yeah, I definitely think that this form of work that my peers in history are doing, and the different methodologies that are created to make sense of new materials that historians maybe have not worked with before, is a form of smooth or resilience, if you want to say. This is a way to recognize that the methodologies that were used, that most of them have helped us to see history from above. But the peculiarity of the history that we're talking about pushes us towards coming up with new forms of methodologies to explain like archives under erasure, and so to get an account of history from below, to recognize, as what we were talking about, the lived experience of these individuals, rather than big claims that, I don't know, the UN partition caused the establishment of the State of Israel. Okay, but what were the people doing then, right? Under these big slogans, what was the raw reality? And I think the raw reality is the one that's portrayed by these archival materials. And the raw, like, what does it mean for us to reconstruct the past, where all what we can have is UN partition caused this, the Zionist consolidation caused that? Is that really a fair reconstruction of the past? Does that really give the voices of the individuals who have lived throughout it? And I think the proper way is to recognize that there is no one ex ante model or one unified methodology that would apply to all of the cases.
Thank you so much. No,
yeah.
And well, sumut, for those who don't know, is like a political practice of resistance for Palestinian people, and it's a political, peaceful resistance. So I think your work is crucial. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Yuvat. And now, Teresa, please.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much, Susanna. I really enjoy your talk, and I think I agree with Hanik. It's really important. Really important work. And I wanted to share something. May I share my screen and ask your opinion? Because I recently found this book. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
We see black.
Let me see. No, yet.
Not yet. It's loading.
Now we see it.
Right now.
Spring is here.
You can see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Still seeing it? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So so it's this book about these flowers. You can see it once the spring is here,
Yeah.
and it's all this embroidering that women in Palestine did.
Yeah.
And I'm taking this class about archives, and we were talking about the possibility of these embroiderings. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing. Can be also kind of an archive or archival material because now I understand that there's a problem because of water control. So maybe there are no gardens anymore, and there's this part of the history of the society that involves flowers and gardens that you cannot like document except for this kind of practices. And I just wanted your opinion, if you can add this to to your research, or I don't know.
Yeah, I would love to do that. If you would allow me to share the screen again,
Yes.
there's some things in passing that I guess I wish I have the chance to. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So this is from the book that I mentioned, the project of the children's testimony through drawings and the captions under them. And here in the caption, you have Nawal, 8 years old. She says that the trees were laden with fruit. The enemy's airplanes came and bombed the camp, and the trees, the green leaves burned, the roses fell, the apples fell, and the neighbor's daughter also. So it reminds me now what you have shown me about how whether weaving these flowers or making these drawings, they, at the end of the day, are the remains of the past. Unfortunately, there's no one state, because usually the state is the one that's responsible for collecting the archives. The state that was collecting the archives was the Israeli state, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the new and old history, that at some point the state erased some of the archives and did not allow historians to check everything that happened in 1948. So in 1980s, once they have released the archive, they figured the new things that happened. So given that this is the case, then the archive of the state is already not taken as credible, right? And so the work of the historian is with everything that remains, whether we're talking about child throwing, weaved flower, a poem that's written about one's neighborhood, and so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question. If there is, Kirsten, please.
Maria, you should feel free to go first if you. I know that I've noticed that you've had your hand up a few times.
No, that's fine. You go first, and there's going to be enough time for me. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. You gave a really good kind of account of why it is really important that when we go into archives, we understand the history of those archives, and we're able to think about you know, all of the things that have led to the formation of those archives, and all of that, because otherwise we're going to make mistakes and fail to understand the histories. I was curious about access to these archives, which I think is another kind of aspect of archival practice. Can ordinary people go into these archives, or are they kind of restricted? Who do you apply to get into these archives, and so on? The point is there any restriction on the kind of history you can tell by using these archives?
So I'll tell you about the ones that I know. In terms of oral testimonies, they are accessible for the public. There is a website, it's called Palestine Remembered. There is the Poha Institute here, everything is digitized. In terms of the drawings, all of that, you have these books and they are available in libraries. But the village books, they're very rare. So I have them because I know a historian who knows a historian who scanned them, but they're not there for the public, not because of censorship, but just because they're not. Anyway, the ones that have to do with the historians also work with indictments that whenever every individual was put into investigation, they would see the list of indictments, the investigation that happened. These ones are restricted. But the historians that I work on live in Ramallah, so they live in the West Bank. They're in Birzeit University. They do have access from time to time. They go into investigation. They get imprisoned for a couple of days, unfortunately. But yeah, so the work with official documents is difficult. The work with other forms of testimonies, drawings, and so is much more accessible. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Thank you very much. My question is more related to the epistemology of this type of historical explanations, because you made a very good case for weakening the methodology. But with the weakening of the methodology or the changing of the methodology, there is also going to be a change in the explanation epistemology, right? So one of the reasons why we wanted something like Hegelian explanations were because they were epistemically very much robust. So they were very resistant. They were more or less fixed because they depended on laws and things like that. So I was wondering in these cases whether what we are going to end up with is something very weak or very defeasible. Because as you were saying, as much as we incorporate different testimonies and different evidences of testimony, like the drawings, that are very susceptible of interpretation, even from the author themselves. So a child drawing something might change totally the perspective of what he was drawing after a couple of years, after a decade. And so all of these things are going to change through time, maybe making what we thought that was explanatory totally mistaken, or So what are your thoughts on this, please?
I agree with you. This is one of the crucial challenge to what I've been working on. For now, I don't have a definite answer. I can tell you that we can stick to some pragmatic values in terms of coherence, scope, comprehensive account, and so. But I think at least the aspiration towards robustness was the problem why we ended up with the history from above. I think that we ought to be revisionist about history. If later on these accounts at the end of the day, what does it mean for drawing to be relevant or irrelevant? Even here, relevancy would have a different approach. So I'm aware of this challenge. I'll be thinking about it more. But for now, this is the answer I have.